strive to be like you, Lord. I want to follow you.
This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid out somewhere beyond the blue. The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore. Oh Lord, you know I have no friend like you. If heaven's not my home, then Lord, what will I do? The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore. Oh Lord, you know I have no friend like you. If heaven's not my home, then Lord, what will I do? The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore. Some glad morning when this life is o'er, I'll fly away to a home on God's celestial shore. I'll fly away, away. Oh Lord, you fly away, oh glory. If heaven's not my home, then Lord, what will I do? The angels beckon me, hallelujah, by and by, and I can't feel at home in this world anyway. In the sweet by and by, we shall meet on that beautiful shore. In the sweet by and by, we shall meet on that beautiful shore. Oh Lord, you know I have no friend like you. If heaven's not my home, then Lord, what will I do? The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel at home in this world
I'm going to ask you to help me say the last part. But since we've been discussing the Lord's commandments the last 4 weeks, I want to point out as I read the first part of this verse. Micah 6, verse 8. He has told you, O mortal, what is good. We already know it's there. And what does the Lord require of you? Join me. But to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God.
Micah 6:8 has a special place in my heart. I have always enjoyed reading it. I enjoyed studying it growing up. And one of the beautiful things about divinity school is you get to focus on the things you like once in a while, especially when you're preaching on it. Rob mentioned last week what it means to have a purpose in life. What is the purpose of life? And the answer was love. To love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And to love your neighbor as yourself. But we still have questions. Part of the problem, it's wonderful to have it succinctly. It's wonderful to have it in a sentence or two. But what does it mean to act these things out? What are some examples of what that looks like? What should I do with my life? What is the purpose with what I do, where I go, who I see? What indeed does the Lord require of me? What does He require of you? They're hefty questions. If they're honest, we probably actually don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about them. Now, why might that be? It's probably because there's a whole lot of things to do in our lives. There are places to go, there are people to see, there's jobs and tasks to accomplish. It never really seems to end. We're expected to care for children, for our grandchildren, the friends of our children's friends. Take your pick. And that all comes without even the fun of, working a job, spending time with your own friends before we become estranged or grow too far apart to call them more than an acquaintance. Or, what about the family that counts on us, our own spouse, our own kids? We have to support them emotionally, mentally, spiritually, monetarily sometimes. So where's the time to be a philosopher? Where do we have time to consider these things? Study after study shows that optimal sleep time for us, for most individuals, is somewhere between 7 and 8 hour range. For, senior folks, it's a little bit less. For teenagers, it's a little bit more. Just kind of depends on your life, what you plan to do, what you need to do. But it has been proven that if you're not getting this sleep, if you're not getting this rest, it's going to lead to grogginess, obviously. Unhealthy eating habits, you got higher blood pressure, higher aggression. You have a shorter attention span. You have an imbalance in biochemistry. It's just a fancy way of saying you don't quite feel like yourself, and you're going to get sick a whole lot easier. And through all this, you have an impaired decision-making skill. Your brain's not working at full power. Now, if you somehow live a life where none of these things impact the things you do, let me know so I can join, because that would be fantastic. However, for most of us, these health issues would probably be a problem. And yet, as a nation, as a people, as a world in general, we're tending towards less and less sleep by the day, by the month, by the year. According to my wife, who's studying to be a physical therapist, this is her specialty. Sleep duration and the quality of this sleep are actually now being used as health markers for physical and mental health. It lets doctors know how well you're doing just by how well and how much you're sleeping. Agencies that study these trends, agencies that study sleep patterns, and wouldn't that be a nice job to have found that we're continuously losing sleep compared to previous generations. Most of the people I know, most of my classmates, some of them gladly and some of them with a very sad shame, recount how many nights it's been since they had a full night's sleep. How long has it been for you? American culture is terrible about promoting a lifestyle that goes and goes and goes without rest until you're exhausted. You have to do everything you possibly can to finish what you have in your job, what you need done in your short period of time, and we just love talking about how busy we are, how many conversations involve just how many things we have to do. And so in our rush to do it all, to see it all, to be it all, we kind of are neglecting one of the most important factors that lets us be, us, as we were intended to be. But we're not the first people to have this problem. If I recall correctly, in the Christian calendar and in the Jewish calendar, there's a whole day every week dedicated precisely to rest, to recompose, to understand who you're supposed to be. It's today. It's the Sabbath. For us, it's Sunday. For the Jewish calendar, it's Saturday. But why? We sleep every night. Might not be enough, but we do sleep to recover for the next day. So what makes a single day so special? Why is there space? In the 10 most sacred commandments that we hold dear, God gave us one to remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. Could it be there's more to the Sabbath than just going to church for a few hours and taking the day off of work? What if instead the Sabbath was intended as a reminder for us to take the time to reflect on what it means to truly rest, nor that we might be truly alive? Our message today from Micah comes from one of the final books of the Old Testament, and yet this book was still written some 700 years before the birth of Christ. Micah carries within it one of the most well-known and well-understood verses in the Christian faith, though you may not have known it. This is one of the most well-known and well-cited ones. In chapter 6, the people of Israel are conversing with the prophet. They're trying to figure out what indeed do they need to do. How should we worship God? How do we go about following God's commands? And for some reason, they can't agree on how best this is to be done. Sound familiar? In the time that Micah is writing, right up until the day that Christ walked the earth, he came as the ultimate sacrifice. But the followers of Yahweh, the followers of God, need to be ritually clean before they could even begin to worship Him. Before they could go to the temple to sacrifice, to make offerings, to prepare themselves for this worship, they have to go make a sacrifice. Most of us know the story of Abraham and Isaac, that God called Abraham to come to the mountain to make the ultimate sacrifice to prove that he was ready to offer everything in his power to worship God and his commitment to following God. In a similar light, the people of Israel gather around Micah. They're trying to understand exactly what they need to do to please the Lord. In a poetic form, the author writes to us. We know these verses. They were read a few moments ago. One of the ideas of the crowd, they start in chapter 6, verse 6. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before Him with burnt offerings, calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the seed of my soul? It might sound morbid. Sounds a little creepy to me. If we're talking about these suggestions, these offerings that are being made to God in order to say we're sorry, in the hope that they might please God. But what I hear, what I believe is the intent of this passage, is to show the incredible over-exaggeration that these people will go through in order to avoid the real work of following God's commands, of following the law as He intended it to be. See, the problem we have inherently with offering sacrifices is that it's essentially an apology. It's an I'm sorry for what I've done. Here is proof of my apology. I have done wrong. I have fallen short. I have sinned. And I must apologize to the Lord. Pastor Rob talked about the ultimate purpose of all people last week in the command to love God and to love people. But even before Jesus came, God was giving His people the words and the advice and the message they needed to understand the purpose for their lives. And Micah gives an answer to the people in response. It's not sacrifices, it's not rams, it's not olive oil, it's certainly not the firstborn. But He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. To act, to love, and to walk. These are three things. A way to show a life that honors God in a way that no sacrifice ever could. You know the old saying, actions speak louder than words? It's a similar idea. It's just the idea that a life lived in a way that serves God speaks much louder than a lifetime full of apologies ever could. The three commands are simple. They're action words. They're commands. They're states of being. They are verbs to speak to this day's message. As the title suggests, it is an action, an occurrence, a state of being to love mercy, to seek justice, and to walk humbly. To serve the Lord, we must be willing to go and do, not simply wait and see. The life of Christians is not one that's designed to wait around and see what God will do. Now, I know what a lot of you are thinking, in that there's a whole lot of waiting in this life. I'm waiting on some things. I'm sure you're waiting on some things. And sometimes that waiting, that verb, can be the very hardest one to do in following God. But in doing His service, in following justice, in doing the work that God has intended for us, we are not called to sit back and wait. It's a call to action, a way to live that the world will know that we are here to love and to serve. So what then does the Lord require of you? To act justly. Their act is the very description given to what is required, to go about doing justice. Justice is broad, wide, deep, ancient word. Where do you even begin? But we know it when we see it, don't we? We understand that something is just or unjust when we see it in action. An ancient description of justice is not simply in following the rules or following the law as we're told. Rather, it's a deliberate act of giving every individual what they are owed. This may sound obvious in passing, but if we truly claim to be God's people, what might that justice entail? If every single individual is birthed from the Spirit, from the will of God, if all of us are dust, and to dust we will return, if every breath within us is a gift by God and a proof of His love, and it makes every one of us unique, special individual who is utterly irreplaceable, how might that change the way we live our lives? How might we argue the cause of the widow, the powerless, the exploited, the downtrodden? How might we look at those who are starving, alone, and cold in the world when we have enough and more? If we know God has called them to life and that they are children of the Most High, and we've been given enough, what would it look like to seek God's justice rather than just our own? We can show the lost and alone the dignity that they reserve. The humanity bestowed on every individual as a child of God. To act justly is to seek and find where God calls us to serve, not merely where we wish we could serve, and be willing to do the work when we get there. In addition to acting justly, He also calls us to love mercy. How many times do we have to be reminded that this is a God of love and mercy, and not one of wrath and vengeance? Hellfire and brimstone are fun sermons every once in a while. They're a word from God. There's a place for them. But to live a life that follows God only set to terrify and to punish, waiting for us to fall short, it's not a God I know. It's not the God that I was called to follow, and certainly not the God that Jesus preaches in the gospel. In the book of Matthew, Peter asked Jesus how often he ought to forgive his neighbor, his brothers, and his sisters. 7 times. Now think about how often someone offends you. How many times have you forgiven them? If you were to actually say, I forgive you, I surrender my ego, my pride, and I'll let you go about your business. I don't have to have the last word. Once, twice, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But no, Jesus answers 70 times 7. It's a really high number. But we're not meant to count it out. But even if you were to try to keep track of the 490 times that Jesus says to accept an apology, to forgive those who have done us wrong, you're still missing the point. Jesus wasn't calling us to act in counting. He wasn't calling us to do math to figure out how often we ought to forgive. He means that we ought to forgive as Jesus forgives, as the Father forgives, to cast a sin as far as the east is from the west and to say, I have forgotten it. Let us continue on. If we are to love mercy, if we are to show mercy as a verb, then we need to actively choose to follow others, to love others, to forgive others, because we have already been forgiven. To forgive each time with a mental follow-up, but next time, they're going to get it. It's missing the point. You're waiting. That's vengeance. That's pride. That's not forgiveness. That's not mercy. That's not what God intended. It's simply brushing off a frustration until you can get the next hook back. Now, this isn't giving a get-out-of-jail-free card to everyone in your life who would walk all over you. It's not calling for you to smile while you're being walked on, being taken advantage of time and time again. Be smart. Avoid the situations that will hurt you, mentally, physically, and pray to God that He will be with you in these situations because they will come. Pray that He will be with you when you are afraid. Change something if there is a pattern in your life of nothing but abuse. But remember that God in His mercy has forgiven you. And He has forgiven us more times than we can count. And to love mercy as He does is to extend that mercy to those who wrong us and to love them all the same. The final command is to walk. To walk humbly with your God. And we walk past this, pun intended, so quickly in our Bibles very often. It's easy to slide by because we hear it a lot. we quoted out, to walk humbly with your God. Well, obviously, that's what you do. That's who we are. God is God and I am not. The throwaway phrase. It was a good point, John. I'm not discounting it. Just so you know. But I wanted to take the time to break down and slow down, to walk, as Pastor Rob mentioned in his message this week, and not race to the finish, not sprint to the end, but to take time to understand why this particular phrase was included by the prophet as to how to serve God. We're called to walk. So life's not a sprint. It's not a race to the finish. It is called a race by Paul in 2 Timothy, but it's not a race that can be won by flesh or blood or power or training, at least not physically. Our Christian life is a walk. It's unhurried, unstressed, and assured of a destination. How wonderful is it to be assured that there is a place to be? To some, it might even appear to be wandering. You might not be sure where you're going at all times. Other people certainly might be wondering where you're going. Have you ever been asked, what are you doing? Sometimes the Spirit leads and we just have to follow. But we rest in the assurance that Christ has come to walk with us, taking the time to find where we are and find where we're called, rather than blindly rushing forward to the next station and the next and the next. We're called to walk humbly. Humility is one of the most difficult virtues to attain, precisely because the acquisition of it leads directly to its opposite. If you are proud of being humble, you're an oxymoron. I've certainly been guilty of it once in a while. It's very difficult to understand true humility because to try to gather it on our own is pride. It's foolishness. It can't be done by human effort alone. I don't believe it's possible. When someone does something to you, when you're insulted, when you're angry, when you're afraid, have you ever felt that way? Have you ever thought about what to do next? How we're going to solve that problem? Is your first thought to leave it to God, or is it how the problem will be solved by your own two hands? Or someone else who might help you out with it? To be humble takes time. It takes effort. It takes an emptying of oneself and one's ego and full surrender to the Spirit and understanding what God calls us to be. It takes a lot of that Spirit. I'm just now starting to understand that, and I've got a long way to go, and I'm sure several of you can understand exactly what I'm saying. To walk humbly is a lifetime commitment. It's not something you can turn on and off. It's not something you think just once in a while. It is a choice, a verb, to choose to walk humbly with your God. We're called to walk humbly with our God. This Christian life, this walk, is not something to be taken alone. We're meant for community with God, with our friends, with our church, with our fellow believers, with people we don't even know because we are called to follow the same God that they were. The service and the love that we offer one another is made to satisfy our neighbors, not just ourselves. We're not called to serve ourselves. We're not called to love ourselves. This is the complete opposite of what Jesus asks us to do. To be able to live in Christian community means precisely that, to live in community with one another, to offer your time, your effort, your sacrifices to ensure the kingdom's benefit, to ensure the furtherance of the word and the benefit of your neighbor above yourself, to love your neighbor as or even above yourself. Sure, you can serve yourself. You can argue the semantics that, yeah, I can have a community of one. But that's not what Jesus called for. That's not what Jesus asked us to go out and do. The two greatest commandments were the Shema, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and to love your neighbor as yourself. There are no greater commands than these. You're called to walk humbly with your God. Not your parents' God, not your pastor's God, not your friend's God. Your God. He's called you into relationship with Him. He's called us into relationship with Him, so much so that He came down to become one of us, to have a relationship with us, because it was so impossible for us to reach out, he reached out first. In the same vein, we cannot force that relationship with God onto others. How much pain and suffering has come through the history of our people by forcing the God of our ancestors onto others. God does not force himself onto us. When this happens, when we force him onto others, we've completely missed the point. This is a God who wants a relationship with you. And as Jesus answered Peter, when Peter asked, "But what about him?" Jesus answered, "What is that to you? You follow me." To walk humbly with your God. God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the Almighty Deliverer, the Mighty One of Israel, Alpha and Omega, Yahweh, the Lord. The names for God are many in the Bible, almost more to the count. Several hundred, if I'm correct. There's a few differing beliefs on it. When we call out to God, we are told that God will answer. Perhaps he's answering you right now. Is there something you're asking for? Is there something you need? Something that you feel that you cannot do without? He tells us to call out, and he will hear and he will answer. The name of Yahweh is an interesting one because it comes from the ancient Jewish word for Lord. That's the closest description we have. When you open your Bible and you see the small but bolded Lord, that is the name of Yahweh. It is also the only singular name for a God in the ancient world that the Jews lived in. The names for God were plentiful, they were plural, but only the Jewish nation said that no, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. That same word, Lord, in our Bibles is Yahweh. Yahweh was not spoken in the Jewish faith. It was considered too sacred, too special, too singular to be spoken except by the high priest, the holiest man, on the holiest day of the year. When Jesus tore the veil at his passing, that was the release that we could now reach out and touch the divine, to touch the sacred. Yahweh was not spoken. It was barely written. Yahweh invokes the power of a creator God, the one who designed the universe and yet desires a relationship with us as intimate as the person sitting next to you, our friends and our family. An interesting discussion that I heard and I particularly love is the letters that make up Yahweh. Y, H, W, H. Said aloud, are the human sounds of breathing. This is part of the reason they did not speak the word of God, but instead proclaimed it quietly. They thought it, because this word is made up of the very air we breathe, the sounds that we make when we speak. What if the entire life of our person, of our friends and our family, is speaking the name of God over and over again, and when they pass away, is not because we've died, it's because we can no longer speak the name of God. May we hear the name of God in everything we say and everything we do. Now you might be wondering to yourself why all this began with a discussion on sleep patterns. Well, these particular requirements to seek justice, act justly, to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God are not acts to be taken lightly. It's not for the lighthearted, it's not for the faint-hearted, or those who would be easily dissuaded. And if we do not stop to rest, if we do not take time to refresh, to understand what God calls us to be, if we refuse to honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy, we cannot possibly hope to fulfill the plan that God has for each of us. To seek justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God is to live out a command, an action, a verb, to love God and to love others. May we take the time and the rest to fully comprehend what this call may mean. Amen. To seek justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. An action, an occurrence, state of being. I pray that these will be on our minds, on our hearts as we go about this week, that we will not simply leap from one call to the next, but we will take time to walk there, to smell the roses, if you will, to take time to enjoy the journey. May God grant us the peace to reach it there in His name. Amen.